This book of the Bible was brought to you by the letter P. Here's an easy way to remember the gist of Genesis. When you think of the first book of the Bible, think of the letter P. P for patriarchs and P for promises. Genesis revolves around both. Let's start with the patriarchs. By definition, patriarchs are those considered to be the fathers of the human race, or more specifically, the fathers of the Israelites. These patriarchal names from Genesis may sound familiar. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. But the story of the patriarchs in Genesis wouldn't be complete without the story of their faith in God. And that's where the second P comes in. The patriarchs faced their fair share of trials in Genesis. They dealt with barren wives, warring children, and even enemies from the outside. Through all of these challenges, though, their commitment to God remained steadfast. And so did God's covenant with each of them. The promise for each patriarch had three parts: offspring, blessings, and land. And in each case, God's promises in Genesis were fulfilled. Genesis isn't always a pretty book. There's a flood that destroys most of the human race. There are brothers who kill or undermine brothers. There are deceptions and betrayals. But there's also a promise in Genesis 1 that no matter how messy things get, no matter how far away we seem to be from God, there is still one fundamental fact of creation that we'll all wake up to. It's spelled out in Genesis 1:31. And God saw everything that he had made, and behold, it was very good. Even the structure of Genesis revolves around the letter P. That's because Genesis divides neatly into two sections: primeval history and patriarchal history. The primeval history portion of Genesis includes chapters 1 through 11. It contains the creation story in Genesis 1, the story of Adam and Eve in Genesis 2 and 3, and the story of Cain and Abel in chapter 4. After Genesis 5, which records all the descendants of Adam, the rest of the primeval history focuses on Noah's story and the story of his sons. Another way you can think of the primeval history portion of Genesis is as a back and forth between goodness and wickedness. Everything is very good in Genesis 1, but it becomes corrupted in chapters 2 through 6. At the end of chapter 6, and in this chapter 7, God spares Noah, who is righteous and good, while the rest of the earth is cleansed from its wickedness by a terrible flood. All is good again at the end of Genesis 8, when dry ground appears and Noah builds an altar to God. But by chapter 9, wickedness has begun to creep in again. The arrogance of those building the Tower of Babel in chapter 11 angers God, and the primeval history ends with humankind scattered and divided. The patriarchal history portion of Genesis includes the rest of the book, chapters 12 through 50. In chapters 12 through 25, we get the extended story of the first patriarch, Abram, who becomes Abraham. Abraham's story is characterized by great devotion and the fulfillment of God's promises. He is given land in Canaan. He gains political status in Canaan, and he is given two sons, Isaac and Ishmael, and promised by God that his descendants will be as numerous as the stars. The second half of the patriarchal history, or chapters 26 through 50, chronicles the lives of three key figures: Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. Like Abraham, each of these patriarchs receives a promise from God, a covenant of prosperity. And though each of these three men goes on to make his share of mistakes, God's promise is fulfilled in each case.
When waves roar and front of me, so high that I can't see you. I don't have to be afraid.
When your voice is calling me to deep seas I've never traveled, I don't have to be afraid. I know your promises are true, promises are true. I believe you. Give me faith in everything I do. You light my way. Come on, let's go on a journey, sailing the ocean of God's great love. Come on, let's go on a journey, holding on to His promises from above. I'll trust the Lord with all my heart, and He'll direct my path. Come on, let's go on a journey of God's grace.